We're the book friends that think good.
What does this mean for our life, for our world? Yiggity yeet, my dude. I'm happy to speak. Always happy to think.
I don't know how to do that. I can look into that.
Makes you sound like a book friend that can think good.
It's Jack and it's Weston.
BFTTGs. Yeah.
Jack, I think good. Sometimes I good think, too.
Makes you sound pretty good.
We might want to make it more concise. We are going to attempt to grapple and answer 3 questions. Number 1, what did we learn? Number 2, what did we disagree with? And number 3, what are we going to do about it? I am ready to roll.
I'm in it. Weston, my book friend, tell me, what book is it that we're thinking good about today?
Today, we are having fun with averages. And, we're going to talk about Chapter 2 of Field Guide to Lies and Statistics.
My favorite line of this chapter was the opening line, where he says, an average can be a helpful summary statistic, even easier to digest than a pie chart. Easy to digest.
That's a pretty good one. That's a pretty good one.
Yeah, I kind of like that. I was like,
So basically in this chapter, Levitin kind of just points out the flaws of hearing the word average and shows different ways that statistics and averages can be manipulated. So I had a big learning early on in this chapter that was kind of a big shock to me. I had never heard of average meaning anything other than the mean. So Levitin talks about how people can, like statisticians or whatever companies, whatever, can use average to mean the mean, the median,
or the mode.
Yeah, and I did not know that. I thought average and mean were synonymous. So that was a big thing for me. I was like, oh, I wonder how many times I've read average and thought mean in my head and didn't realize that it could be the median or the mode because I didn't think that was a thing.
Yeah, those are all just It really is interesting because I think that's what you're taught in school, or at least that's what I
teach. That's why I was like, dude, in my textbook it says, but then I Googled it, and then Google says that an average can be any of the 3, or any other number to show the center of data.
Yep. I actually learned most about this when I was doing statistical modeling for a business I used to work for, because I would report averages in costs and revenue, right? And I remember one day presenting a report and my boss asking me to exclude outliers, just saying, well, did you include outliers in this? I said, yeah. And he said, just remove those. I need more of like a median number. And I was like, oh, well, so you don't want averages? And he's like, no, I want averages with excluded outliers. And I thought, oh, okay, that makes sense. And then, in other scenarios, we often had things with bimodal distributions and stuff like that, which to me was a really, one of the things I really liked that he brought up, not necessarily a learning, but reminded me of my days when I was doing this for this company. What we would do when we had bimodal distributions is we would split this set statistically. So we would analyze each one, which I always thought was maybe, I don't know. I had mixed feelings about that, but I will say he presents that as a completely reasonable option with bimodal distribution. He says, better yet, a way to address bimodal distributions is to subdivide the groups into 2 groups and provide statistics for each. And that's something that I used to do, practically speaking. And I always kind of thought like, oh man, are we massaging this data just to get what we want to see? And the reality is we were, but we were doing it in an educated manner. It was like done purposely because it's like, oh, well, these statistics could be misleading if we just use averages. I guess that was a good learning for me, like to see how many cases in which the mean average, really just adding up all of the sets and dividing them, can be wildly skewed by outliers.
Yeah. Pulling to the left, pulling to the right with one big fish or one tiny fish or whatever. Yeah. Yeah, I think you're going to speak more in these few chapters. You probably have more experience with this stuff, being in sales and your kind of jobs. Whereas like
Mhm.
me, since I'm just like teaching the basics and I don't see a ton of it, I'm just wondering for myself, how many times have I been fooled by something?
Yeah. Well, we were talking, Weston, about the law of large numbers.
Mm-hmm.
How difficult it is for us as individuals to conceive of numbers larger than 1,000, right? Or you just go, oh, big number.
Yeah.
Um, and
Or
we were
that's a
talking a little bit.
lot.
Yeah, yeah. And we were talking a little bit about how probably a big part of that is like because humans developed in small tribes, right? Like sociologically, there's this number, and I think it's maybe 52 or 48. Anyway, it's around about 50, the Dunbar number, which I've always remembered because of my last name. But the Dunbar number is it was some sociologist who um, determined like this is the number of relationships with some degree of depth that you can maintain in your life. And that means like more than just I think 5 facts about a person. So
Hmm.
like the names of their family members, their birthday, their like some story
Like
about
what
their
their
life.
job is, what they want to do, like anything like that.
Yes.
Just knowing more
Yeah,
than
yeah.
five things about someone.
Yeah, you can only maintain relationships of like 50 um, for any given like period of time.
Yeah.
Um, and that's like I think that is a huge reason why we have such a hard time with large numbers is we were never meant to live in such large numbers, you know? So like when you hear that somebody has an income of like, he gives the example of mean incomes and he says, well, if you're looking at the average and then you have Mark Zuckerberg in the room, whose income is like $35 million,
Yeah.
what was it,
35
35
billion. We're
billion?
35
Yeah,
billion. Yeah.
35 billion. And then you have normal people with net worth of like 100,000. Like you have a huge outlier.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that I wasn't well acquainted with in school until I
Mm.
got into the real world and started to see more large numbers. Like I was talking about from business, you have one product that's like, you know, losing, and you report, we'll probably talk about percentages at some point because percentages can be kind of dubious, but it looks like it's losing like 50,000% or something because it's, you know, you're paying way more than you're making on it. But then you have other products where you're making 4% on hundreds of them, right? So when you average that, it looks really bad, but that outlier is so far off that
Mm.
it really skews the set. And I think when we think about large numbers like that, that's not usually what we're presented in grade school. We're presented like, here's an outlier. You have like 8, 8, 8, 9, 9, 10, 10, 12, and 4. And it's like,
Yeah.
okay, well, those are outliers, but they're not really skewing the set all that much,
Yeah. That actually makes me really happy with. So, because now I want to focus on statistics more this year. Like that was already a focus for me trying to get to that unit earlier in the year. And I built in some huge outliers for sure. Where like I would have a set like that, like you're talking about, because I totally agreed. And I was like, the kids need to understand that like data sets are not so homogenous all the time. And so I put one, I think I have one in there that I have like 4, 5, 7, 6, 5, 4, 10,000. 1,
Yeah,
2.
right. There you go.
Like I have
Yeah.
stuff like that in there, or I'll have a really small one that I stick in there because I think that also for me, I was just viewing it as an educator. Like that's going to show me if they actually know how to graph this stuff, right? That's going to
Hmm.
show me if they actually get the concept better, and if
Yeah,
they're actually paying attention to the details rather than
sure.
just giving a few
Yeah.
simple ones. But
Well,
yeah,
I wonder how much of this has to do with our modern life too, and our ability to analyze large numbers, and also the realities of large numbers appearing in more places. Like, think about science for hundreds of years, like measuring temperatures. Even if you have a huge outlier, it's only by a matter of 1 degree, right?
yeah,
Like
or like one
a
degree
10.
can be huge.
Yeah, a factor of 10 is what I mean, right? So like,
Mm,
uh, you know,
okay.
you can be like, you can have 30 degrees and 110 degrees in the same set, right? Reasonably.
Yeah.
But like once you start adding microscopy to it and you have, scientific notation that goes down to like microns, you can have, you can be off by degrees of 10, right? Or millions, which really skews the data set. And I think something similar with income, like it was reasonable 200 years ago to assume that the disparity in income in a room was not going to be billions of dollars. But now it's actually a reasonable thing that could happen in more places.
I mean, I don't know about reasonable, but
Yeah.
maybe, I mean, billions? Because isn't there still only like, isn't there still only just like less than 100 billionaires or something in the world? I don't know. We should look look some things up.
We should look up statistics on that.
Yeah, we should do that.
plus like income, like billionaires, like so many ways you can skew those statistics. Yeah. Like, oh, this person's a billionaire because they own all this property.
Yeah, and a lot of it's like not liquid at all.
Yeah.
And they can't really, but anyways.
Yeah. We digress a bit, but I think the main point is just how much we're collecting large data more than we used to.
Yeah.
Probably more than any other time in history, for sure.
Yeah, I think we're definitely dealing with as companies have gotten more global, like, and wider access has been available to more people, we collect more data from more people. Just generally leads to bigger numbers that we're analyzing. But yeah, the average, I do like that he mentions the ecological fallacy and the exception fallacy, because I do think that is something that I've definitely sinned in that way in the past, for sure. Basically going, I thought it was funny because because of my degree in philosophy, I took a few logic courses and I know about a lot of fallacies. I'd never heard of these fallacies called these names, but I knew the concept as just, it's never good to extrapolate from an individual to a group or extrapolate from a group to an individual. So that's the ecological fallacy, is going from an individual to a group, and then the exception fallacy, or no, I think I said those backwards.
The
exception fallacy is going from an individual to a group, and the ecological fallacy is going from a group or a population to an individual. And that was connected to his discussion on the bimodal distributions that you talked about, which it makes sense to me. I just have never dealt with anything like that. So it's cool that you said that you've dealt with those things and like seen them.
Oh yeah. Yeah, well, it makes sense, right? Like a really common place where I would see this was in managing inventory. So you have inventory where you have different types of products. Like obviously they need to be assessed as different statistic sets. But if you look at your catalog, then you're looking at a completely different statistic set. And so like bimodal distribution is helpful to identify, but then helpful to break down and examine its appropriate areas. Because you might say like, oh, is this a category error? Which I think is a really common reason that bimodal distributions exist.
Yeah.
Where it's like, say you're looking at
like I just thought of one that it would be a category error, I think. Like I was thinking about how if you looked at like diapers bought by age of the person, right? Yeah. Like you're going to see a very bimodal distribution, but you're missing the category of like adult diaper versus baby diaper, or like size of the diaper.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, that's a perfect example. Yeah.
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 So, the other thing I wanted to point out, just as a little, gave me a giggle, was on page 17, because I wasn't expecting it, where he talks about how you have to be careful of averages and how they're applied, and talking about disparate populations. And he says this can lead to observed observations like, on average, humans have one testicle. And I just was not expecting to read that, so I laughed out loud at it. But that's another category error. So I like that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really like clear one where that's one of my biggest pushbacks with this stuff in this book so far, is like that one is obvious.
Yeah.
But some of these are not so obvious, right? Like I read that and instantly laughed and thought, oh, that's ridiculous. Yeah. I mean, like, and I understand how that happens, because when you sample women, of course, like you get a different, different number.
And I like how he talks about there's more women, so the median and the mode is 0.
Yeah. Right.
But the average
Yeah.
is still like
Yeah.
0.98.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah, totally. But like the really interesting ones to me were, and this is where I think you need to train yourself to really see this stuff, were things like the average person doesn't live in the average city. These were the ones that were really interesting to me. The average golfer doesn't shoot the average round. The average person doesn't live in the average city. Most students don't go to the average sized college. Like, claims like that are true by the numbers, but are so non-intuitive.
right.
Or like the one that he spends a lot of time on is the example of like average number of children in a family,
The
and
siblings
average number
one.
of siblings.
Yeah.
That was so interesting.
He has a great graph that shows this visually on page 23. I'll put on screen. Where he's talking about how you take a select population of children and families, and then the average number of kids is very different from the average number of kids with siblings, because every kid that has a sibling counts as 2 for that.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Or counts as another one. Like if you have five siblings, that's 5 kids that count as having siblings.
It compounds.
So yeah, exactly. It gets like
right?
exponential. Yeah.
Every kid in a family of 6 has 5 siblings, so that counts like 25 siblings or 30 siblings, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that kind of stuff is really interesting when you think about just the way that we use language and how much language affects numbers. Like.
Mm-hmm. And to yours, because you mentioned that you push back against some of the things in this book because he has like an obvious example. I would say I don't push back at that yet, because he does provide some clear examples like right after, where he's saying like, here are some things where it's like not intuitive at all, right? So like that's why we need to be careful, because there's some very obvious ones like the testicle one, but then there's some that are not intuitive and not obvious, like these ones.
Yeah, it's not pushback against the author too. Like I don't find myself pushing back against his logic or writing or anything like that.
Yeah, I don't
It's more just like it raises questions for me. I think sometimes that's like a healthy way to read as well, is not always just looking for like where do I disagree, but what does make me go, where can I press in more to this?
Yeah.
And that's kind of did you find anything to disagree with?
No.
In this
No, and I don't know. Section? This seems like a book where I'm not going to have much like pushback ideologically, Mm-hmm. I think it's just going to be more like you're saying, more eye-opening things, and more things to be like, yeah, I need to be more careful here, or look at this with a more discerning eye. But we'll see, because it's definitely not as much of a like philosophical or ideological book so far.
Yeah,
it's more just like, yo, this is how you can manipulate these things. Watch out.
And this is how people often do manipulate these things.
Yeah.
Right. Like, but also one of the things I was thinking about a lot, maybe we can just get right into what we learned from this section.
I've already talked about those things. So
yeah, not learned, but what we're going to do with it.
Oh yeah.
What am I going to do with this? I think, talking about like one of the things he talks about is like missed opportunity in some regard. Like he talks about looking at this particular room of people. It's like, say you have 9 people in a room, you're looking at average salaries, and you're trying to decide like, should we sell to these people or not? And one person's like $500,000 in debt, and everybody else has $100,000 in the bank, and it's like, so that drags down your average to something like $33,000, and you go, oh man, like that's not. And I was just thinking about that in terms of like, I don't know, other things like household budget, or investment opportunities in small ways, like things like that. Like, can I, sometimes I think I can be a little bit too quick to accept averages, or like, to overblow out, to make
Too much of them.
outliers into like an overblown thing.
Yeah.
I think that tends to make me like nervous about things I do with money, but also in like just assessing my own life a little bit. Looking at some really negative outlier. Like a good example is like Amazon products, right? Like you go on Amazon and you see like, oh, 4.5 stars, and you're like, yeah, but what are all the 1-star reviewers saying?
Yeah.
And sometimes I think I've let that skew me away from things that would be totally fine, or books, or one person's negative opinion. Like maybe I've weighed that too heavily, and I need to think more about the average.
Yeah. You know what I thought about with that too is, so I don't have a big, like, I like to play video games, but I don't have a big video game budget, So I have to be very meticulous with like games that I buy. Like pretty much my wife and I have an agreement where it's like I can buy like one game every month or 2 months, right? Because I don't want to go overboard on it. Plus, like with life and stuff, it's not like I have a ton of time to play every video game I want to get anyway. So I'm not mad about it, right? It's just where I'm at in life.
Yeah.
But I have to be very meticulous, so I read a lot of reviews before I buy video games. And I run into that same thing too, where it's like I might be swayed too heavily by like one person who had a really negative experience with a video game. Or I've also been swayed in the past by like, well, this guy like absolutely loved it, and then like I buy this video game and I'm like, this is garbage.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
So
totally.
it's happened both ways. That was an example I thought of too. And I thought for me, kind of same thing, dude. I just wrote, I need to be more diligent about the word average, and not reading that in my head as mean, and then like looking more closely at, okay, am I actually looking at more the median, more the mode? I just felt like I've been duped in the past, and I need to be more meticulous about average and picking that out, and then disseminating it into what am I actually looking at here, not just the mean.
Yeah. Well, I've been thinking about this a lot as I've been pressing more into game design, because I get the opinions of a lot of people on the games that I create.
Yeah.
And this has been true of me in other areas of my life. Like as a pastor preaching sermons, you get feedback.
One old lady will come up to you and be like, that was not a very good sermon. And you'd be like, oh man, I gave a terrible sermon. But a bunch of people loved it.
Yeah. Or like, one person leaves your church or whatever. And you look at that and you go, oh man, like we're, like sometimes you can really miss the forest for the trees.
Absolutely. And I think that's right.
One of the things I've actually been trying to look for in like my playtest feedback for the games I design are modal observations. So like, what do I hear most often? Like that actually is a good average to shoot for. Like, because if there's a particular frustration, it's probably not best to average that. It's more appropriate to look at it as a mode. Like, well, how often does this particular frustration arise? Is it common? Like, if it's common, that's something to address. If it's kind of like every once in a while, it probably averages out to almost nothing. So I don't know. I think there are lots of applications for these three types of averages that we could use and apply in much smaller and simpler ways in our lives.
Dude, for sure. What I was thinking about with lesson planning is, I've had a lesson and I'll do like an exit ticket, formative assessment, something, and I'll have, 2 kids that just completely didn't get it. And I think early on in my career, I would be like, oh my gosh, I need to completely change, or I need to do this totally different to try and get those 2 kids. But then when I found out, I was like, well, you changed too much. And then all of a sudden I'm losing more kids. I'm confusing more kids. The assessments get worse. They're not showing growth because I was focusing too much on the 2 kids that didn't get it, that if I had looked back at it more objectively, I would have been like, oh yeah, those 2 kids, the ones that were talking the whole time in the back, the ones that weren't paying attention closely, the ones that were doodling on their notes instead of taking notes, right? where I definitely like owned it a little too much, I think. And but I think that's been really good for me as the years have gone on, and seeing that sort of data. Granted, my sample sizes are, you know, just about 25 to 30 every time I do that. So it's not like I have a huge sample size anyway. But then yeah, looking at or I've definitely gone the other way too and had a lesson that like one kid absolutely rocked it, right? And then I would design another lesson like that, but then the other, like, it wasn't beneficial to the majority of the class. And
Yeah, yeah.
so yeah, it's that's a constant ebb and flow too in lesson planning. Not and I've learned to not focus too much on one or two outliers on either side of the class, especially with kids. The other thing is that kid might not be having a great day, or they yeah. So there's so many mitigating factors as well.
Mhm.
But yeah,
I have
you
a
need to
friend.
be.
Yeah, I have a friend who's a small church planter, and what you're talking about just struck me because I was thinking about like if you read books on education, like my friend who's a church planter read a ton of books on like business management and church, like church growth and all this stuff, and so he had all this like general knowledge, but then started working with a team of like 20 people, and it's like, well, this is kind of usually what happens. And it's like, yeah, but you need to know what's happening with those 20 people,
Right.
right? Like,
Right.
and so what he did is he just took that group of people and started looking at their individual personalities through various like personality matrices. They did like Myers-Briggs, they did DISC, they did these different assessments to like see sort of how they work and what they're like, and took a much more personalized approach than a general approach. And I think that that worked to lead that group a lot better because it wasn't made up of averages. It was made up of individuals that are more like a scatter plot, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yep.
there's not a, like when you have a scatter plot and it's like, there can be a like really nice regression. But when you have a scatter plot and it's like,
Hmm.
like you have to come up with different things. I'm sure teaching a class is like that a little bit, where you're like, okay, on the average, most students are pretty like audio visual learners. So like we'll mostly do that. But some students are kinesthetic learners and like they need a special approach
Well,
for that
I would
one
disagree with
student
that
or whatever.
assessment as well.
Oh, sure. Well, I'm just throwing out
Yeah,
something
yeah, I
like
know, I know,
general.
I know.
But
But in general, I
yeah,
would say that idea has kind of been debunked in recent years,
yeah,
and it's just everyone needs. It's better to give all kids all the opportunities, like all the different modalities,
yeah,
because you never know exactly when a kid is going to pick up on it. Sometimes they'll pick up on it auditorily, sometimes they'll pick up on it visually, sometimes they'll pick up on it kinesthetically. Um,
sure.
but but like every
Interesting.
kid needs all of the modalities, and there's kind of a you're not one thing all the time, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, no, that's
So
true.
that's kind of the you have like that's been a focus for me in the past 5 or 6 years, is like giving every kid the total variety of ways that you can view things and learn it and interact with it. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, yeah, it's kind of funny. I was just talking about that recently with a colleague, where yeah, that's right, because they just started their masters, and obviously I did my masters like 10 years ago or whatever. And I was talking about how like yeah, my master's thesis that I wrote and did my big project on or whatever when I was like 22, 23. I don't think I agree with it at all now. Like I think I've totally gone the other way
Yeah.
after having
Well, and part of
implemented
it
it
is,
for a few years. You live and you learn. You live and you learn.
yeah, part of that is like when you're educated classically, it's all averages, it's all numbers, it's all data. You
Yeah,
know,
like a lot. Yeah,
it like that's a lot of what you learn is like, oh, here's, generally how things work, right?
yeah,
Um, like I mean, science is basically like that. Like when I got my science degree, it was like, here's how to figure out averages, and here's like assumptions that we've made for hundreds or thousands of years. And now, like what your work will be if you're going to be a PhD scientist is to break all of those rules. You know, like find the exceptions. Like that's kind of what you're really being asked to do when you're thrust out into the real world. And it's helpful to be mindful of things like outliers and edge cases, and the fact that, like, while a summary statistic is good, that doesn't necessarily speak for an entire set of data. And most of the time, data is made up of either people or real things in the world. They're not just numbers.
Just had a thought. Like, I didn't take notes on this. I just had a thought connected to that. Do you think Karens, people act like are a Karen or a Ken, if we know that term, right? People that basically become self-entitled in a certain situation.
Yeah.
Do you think it's because they don't realize they are an outlier? Like, we need to recognize when we are outliers in situations too, right? Like, I've definitely recognized that when I'm like in this social group, everyone wants to go to this place. I don't really want to go, but I want to hang out with them. So I need to.
Yeah.
So it's like, I wonder if Karens or Kens don't just know, like, don't realize that they are outliers in a particular policy at a company or in a particular situation.
Yeah.
And not thinking that what is good for you is good for the many, right? I think that's a common sin or whatever that we have as people.
Yeah, it's in the exception fallacy, right?
Yeah. Why doesn't this apply, or this thing that's great for me? Why doesn't it good for everyone?
Or like, this bothers me, so it must bother everybody.
Yeah.
It's like, listen, nobody cares that their music is loud. Nobody even notices.
Yeah.
You're the only one. Like.
Yep. You're the only one complaining.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the one of the easiest ways to see this is in a room with temperature, where you're like, I'm cold. Everyone else is like, I'm hot.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, what's up next in Field Guide to Lies and Statistics? We've covered averages. I'm really excited about the next one, axis shenanigans.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be really fun.
I think it's going to be a great chapter. So we'll see you guys next time for axis shenanigans.
Bye. Thank you for joining us, book friends. Next week on the BFTTG pod, Jack and Weston, they're thinking good some more with you, our book friends. Check out the show notes or the description, comment section for a link to the book and any articles that we talk about in the show. Bye-bye, book friends.
Bye for this time, guys.
Do a good thing today.
I love you.
Love you too, dude.